My name is Clara. I am 33 years old and I work as a supply chain analyst for a national retail corporation in Chicago. I stood freezing in the snow on Christmas morning as my parents threw my luggage off the porch. They were evicting me for being 48 hours late on rent for a house they claimed to manage. I walked away with nothing but the clothes on my back and a small metal key my late grandfather had pressed into my hand years ago. When I took that key to a private bank vault the next day, the manager scanned the contents, locked his office door, and told me to sit down. The secret inside that vault would not just destroy my parents' lies. It would leave them facing 20 years in federal prison. Before I share the rest of this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to fight back against toxic family members who tried to take advantage of your hard work. The bitter wind whipped off Lake Michigan at 6 o'clock in the morning, cutting through my thin winter coat like tiny blades. It was Christmas Day. The streets of our suburban Chicago neighborhood were silent, buried under 6 inches of fresh powder. In normal homes, families were waking up, turning on the tree lights and preparing to open presents by the fire. At my house, the front door was thrown wide open, spilling harsh yellow light onto the porch. My mother, Patricia, stepped out into the freezing air, wearing her expensive silk robe. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure contempt, with a sharp shove. She pushed my heavy black suitcase over the threshold. It tumbled down the 3 wooden steps and landed in a snowdrift with a dull thud. My overnight bag followed immediately after unzipping on impact and scattering my sweaters across the icy walkway. I stood at the bottom of the steps, my breath pluming in the freezing air, staring at the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. My father, Richard, emerged from the hallway, holding his steaming mug of expensive coffee. He looked down at me with the exact same expression he used when firing an underperforming employee at his firm. "You brought this entirely on yourself, Clara," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet neighborhood. "We run a tight ship. You know the rules. 2 days late is unacceptable. You are 33 years old and acting like an irresponsible child." I wrapped my arms around my chest to stop the violent shivering. "Dad, it is Christmas morning," I pleaded, my voice cracking from the biting cold. "Not from sadness. I told you yesterday why the transfer was delayed. I just needed 48 more hours until the banks reopened." Patricia scoffed loudly, wrapping her silk robe tighter against the wind. "The bank holiday is not our problem," she snapped. We have told you time and time again that the property taxes and maintenance fees for this house must be paid on the 23rd of every month without exception. We are doing you a massive favor by managing your grandfather Theodore's estate. Do you think the state of Illinois cares about your excuses? Do you think the tax collectors care if it is Christmas for the past 4 years? I had been paying my parents $3,000 a month. When Grandpa Theodore passed away, he left the beautiful 4-bedroom house to the family. My parents immediately took over the administration. They told me that keeping the house in the family required significant financial upkeep. They convinced me to move in, framing it as a generous opportunity for me to build my life while supposedly covering just the baseline costs. I paid them $3,000 faithfully on the 23rd of every single month. I worked 50 and sometimes 60-hour weeks optimizing supply chain logistics just to ensure I never missed a payment. I skipped vacations. I drove a 10-year-old sedan. I poured every ounce of my energy into being the responsible, reliable daughter they constantly demanded I be. And yet, the one single time I was 48 hours late, they decided to throw me onto the street in sub-zero temperatures. There was no warning. There was no grace period. There was just a brutal, calculated eviction. I looked at my mother, searching her perfectly manicured face for even a fraction of maternal warmth. There was absolutely nothing. She stood there sipping her tea, watching me gather my scattered sweaters from the snow with the detached interest of someone watching a boring television show. "You need to learn how the real world works," Richard added, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "You think you are entitled to free housing just because we are your parents? We refuse to enable your financial incompetence any longer. Gather your things and get off the property. If your car is still in the driveway in 20 minutes, I am calling a tow truck." The sheer audacity of his words sent a jolt of adrenaline straight through my frozen veins. I was not crying. The tears that pricked the corners of my eyes were entirely due to the freezing wind. Any sadness I might have felt was instantly incinerated by the pure, unadulterated shock of their cruelty. They were kicking their own daughter out into the snow on Christmas morning over a 2-day delay on a payment I had made flawlessly for 48 consecutive months, without another single word. Patricia turned around and walked back inside the warm, brightly lit house. Richard followed her, slamming the heavy front door shut behind him. The deadbolt clicked into place with a loud, final sound. I bent down, shoved my ruined clothes back into the duffel bag, and dragged my luggage toward my freezing car. I struggled to heave my heavy suitcase into the trunk of my 10-year-old sedan. The lock was frozen solid in the harsh winter weather. I had to hit it twice with the heel of my gloved hand just to get the latch to release. My fingers were completely numb. Ice crunched under my boots as I walked around to the driver's side door, my breath forming thick clouds of white vapor in the frigid morning air. I reached for the door handle, hoping the old engine would turn over in this bitter cold. That was when I heard the creak of the front door opening behind me. For a brief, foolish second, a tiny spark of hope flared in my chest. Maybe my parents had realized what they were doing. Maybe the reality of throwing their own flesh and blood into a sub-zero blizzard on Christmas morning had finally penetrated their obsession with rules and rent payments. I turned around, my hand still resting on the frozen door handle of my car. It was not my parents. It was my younger sister, Brittany. She stepped out onto the porch looking like an advertisement for a luxury winter lodge. She wore a plush cashmere sweater and thick woolen socks, her perfectly styled hair cascading over her shoulders. Both of her hands were wrapped around a steaming mug of hot cocoa, with little marshmallows floating on top. She did not look distressed. She did not look concerned. She looked entirely comfortable watching my misery from the elevated platform of the porch. Brittany was 29, the undeniable golden child of our family. She had always received the grace and financial backing that I was denied. She married Jamal, a highly successful sales director, and they lived a life of constant vacations and designer purchases. I stared at her, waiting for her to say something, hoping she had come out to tell me she had talked some sense into our parents. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate sip from her mug and let out a contented sigh. "You could have just paid on time, Clara," she said casually, as if remarking on the weather. "You know how Mom and Dad get about their schedules. You really brought this drama on yourself." The sheer audacity of her statement knocked the wind out of me faster than the Chicago cold. I marched back up the icy walkway, stopping just at the bottom of the porch steps. "Are you kidding me right now?" I demanded, my voice shaking with a potent mix of freezing temperatures and boiling rage. "You know exactly why my transfer was 48 hours late. You are the entire reason I did not have the $3,000 in my checking account on the 23rd. Brittany rolled her eyes and took another sip of her cocoa. "Do not try to blame your poor financial planning on me." "Poor financial planning," I shouted, no longer caring if the neighbors heard us. 5 days ago, you called me sobbing hysterically. You told me your son had to go to the emergency room for an acute asthma attack. You said Jamal was out of town on a business trip. Your credit cards were maxed out and the hospital needed a $4,000 co-payment before they would admit him for overnight observation. You begged me. Brittany, you swore that if I transferred the money from my savings, you would pay me back the moment Jamal returned. I drained my emergency fund to ensure my nephew got medical care. That transfer cleared my account out, and I had to wait for my corporate bonus to hit to cover my rent. I was late because I saved your son. I expected her to show a shred of guilt. I expected her to at least lower her eyes in shame. Instead, Brittany smiled. It was not a smile of embarrassment. It was a cold, calculated smirk that sent a chill down my spine far worse than the winter wind. "That sounds like a you problem," she said smoothly. "You chose to give me that money. I never forced you to do anything. Jamal is going to be furious when he finds out you lied to him about your finances." I threatened, stepping closer. "You told him your trust fund covered all those designer bags you buy. He has no idea you are begging your sister for emergency cash." Brittany let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Go ahead and tell him he will never believe a jealous, evicted spinster over his own wife. Besides, I already told him you were struggling with money and begging us for handouts. That is why Dad had to evict you. You are a financial liability." I stood there utterly paralyzed by the depth of her deception. She had not just used me as a free bank. She had actively poisoned my name to her husband and stood by while our parents threw me onto the street. "Business is business, Clara," she said, taking one final sip of her cocoa. "Mom and Dad need to eat, and they need reliable tenants. You cannot afford to live here anymore. Good luck starting over." Without another word, she turned around, walked back into the warmth of the house, and shut the door. I was entirely alone. The reality of my situation crashed down on me, heavy and suffocating. I had no home. I had no money left in my savings. I had been systematically drained, discarded, and replaced by a narrative of my own supposed failure. I walked back to my car, the cold finally seeping through the thick layers of my coat, chilling me to the bone. I opened the driver's side door and slid into the freezing driver's seat. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered, coughed, and finally roared to life, blasting freezing air through the vents. I sat there waiting for the heat to kick in, staring blindly at the grand house that my grandfather had built. As I reached into my deep coat pocket to grab my driving gloves, my numb fingers brushed against something hard and metallic. I pulled it out and held it up to the dim light of the dashboard. It was a small, heavy safe deposit box key. Grandpa Theodore had pressed this exact key into my palm 5 years ago, just days before he passed away. He was in his hospital bed, his breathing shallow, but his eyes sharp and lucid. He had gripped my hand with surprising strength, making me look him dead in the eye. "Keep this hidden," he had whispered, his voice raspy but firm. "Your parents care only for appearances, and your sister cares only for herself. They will bleed you dry if you let them. I have made arrangements to protect you. Clara, do not go looking for what this opens until you are pushed to the absolute edge, until they show you exactly who they are." I stared at the key resting in my palm. The metal was freezing, but it felt like a burning coal against my skin. They had shown me exactly who they were. They had pushed me to the absolute edge. I gripped the steering wheel, shifted the car into gear, and backed out of the driveway without a single backward glance. I was not going to cry anymore. I was going to the bank. I drove aimlessly for hours. The streets of Chicago were practically deserted on Christmas Day, a ghost town of snowplows and salted asphalt, with banks and government buildings firmly shuttered for the holiday. My grand determination to uncover Grandpa Theodore's secret had to be put on pause. I had nowhere to go. I had no friends in the immediate area who were not already hosting their own families, and I refused to crash a holiday dinner smelling of eviction and desperation. Eventually, I pulled into a sprawling, snow-covered Walmart parking lot just off the interstate. It was the only place where a lone car sitting idle would not immediately draw the attention of the local police. I parked under a flickering H. halogen street lamp, turned off the engine to conserve my dwindling tank of gas, and prepared to wait. The silence inside the sedan was absolute. The dashboard clock read noon, I had nearly 20 hours to kill before the financial district opened the next morning. Within an hour, the brutal Midwestern cold invaded the cabin. The temperature outside was dropping into the single digits, and the thin metal of my 10-year-old car offered zero protection. I climbed into the back seat and ripped open my ruined luggage, pulling out every sweater, scarf, and pair of sweatpants I owned. I layered them on, wrapping myself in wool and fleece until I could barely bend my arms. My toes burned inside my boots. Every breath I took hung in the air, freezing onto the inside of the windows, until the world outside became a blurry, frosted haze. A heavy lump formed in my throat, that familiar, suffocating precursor to tears. I felt the stinging burn behind my eyes, the natural response to being discarded by the people who brought me into the world. But as the first tear threatened to fall, I wiped it away with the rough wool of my glove. I refused to cry. Crying was for victims, and I was absolutely done being a victim. Lying in the freezing darkness of that back seat, a profound mental shift occurred. The sorrow evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating anger that burned hotter than any heater could. I stared at the frosted roof of my car and began to piece together the reality of my entire adult life. It had never been about teaching me responsibility. It had never been about managing Grandpa Theodore's estate. It was financial abuse. Plain and simple. I thought about the $3,000 I transferred to them every single month. That was $36,000 a year, over 4 years. I had handed my parents nearly $150,000. Where had that money actually gone? I remembered Patricia complaining about the rising costs of property taxes. Yet, she drove a brand new luxury SUV every year. I remembered Richard lecturing me about fiscal prudence. Yet he spent his weekends playing high-stakes golf at the most exclusive country club in the state. And then there was Brittany, my sister, who had never held a real job for more than 6 months, yet lived in a $1 million mansion and paraded around in designer clothes. Jamal made good money, but not that kind of money. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with sickening clarity. I had been funding their illusion of wealth. I was the silent engine powering their high society lifestyle. They kept me isolated, overworked, and constantly stressed about money, so I would never have the time or energy to question the arrangement. Whenever I received a promotion or a corporate bonus, Richard magically discovered a new maintenance issue with the house that required an immediate cash injection. A broken furnace, a leaking roof, a foundational crack that I never actually saw the contractors fix. They had weaponized my sense of duty. They had trained me to believe that my worth in our family was directly tied to my financial compliance. And the moment my compliance faltered, even for a completely selfless reason, like saving my nephew, I lost my value. I was discarded like a broken ATM machine. The anger did not consume me. It focused me. It sharpened my mind into a weapon. I spent the rest of the night running supply chain scenarios in my head, applying my corporate analytical skills to my own life. I mapped out the variables, the key players, the potential risks. I held Grandpa Theodore's safe deposit box key tightly in my palm, letting its jagged edges press into my skin to keep me awake and alert. I did not sleep a single wink that night. As the deep black of the night sky slowly dissolved into the bruised purple of dawn, I sat up. The dashboard clock read 6 o'clock in the morning. Tuesday, December 26th. The holiday was officially over. I climbed over the center console into the driver's seat, my joints aching from the freezing cold. I put the key in the ignition and turned it. The engine groaned, protested, and finally roared to life, blasting much-needed heat into the icy cabin. I scraped the frost off my windshield with a plastic ice scraper, my movements sharp and methodical. I put it in drive and pulled out of the Walmart parking lot. I did not look back. I merged onto the interstate and headed straight for the towering skyscrapers of downtown Chicago. The morning commute was just beginning, a steady stream of headlights illuminating the snow-packed highway. I navigated the familiar routes with a dangerous sense of calm. I parked in the underground garage of the private banking sector, turned off the engine, and took one last deep breath. It was time to find out what my grandfather had left me. I grabbed my purse, locked the doors tightly behind me, and walked steadily toward the heavy glass doors of the bank lobby, completely ready to face whatever truth awaited me inside. The heavy glass doors of the bank lobby parted silently as I stepped into the private wealth management sector. The contrast between the freezing street and the mahogany-lined interior was jarring. A concierge approached me immediately, her eyes scanning my wrinkled coat and exhausted face. But her professional smile never wavered. I told her I needed to access a safe deposit box and requested to speak with the branch manager. She led me to a plush waiting area. I sat with my stomach tied in very tight. Painful knots. 10 minutes later, a tall man with silvering hair walked toward me. He introduced himself as Manager Harrison. His demeanor was polite, polished, and entirely routine. He guided me into his corner office, gesturing for me to take a seat across from his oak desk. He asked for my identification and the key. I handed him my driver license and the cold, jagged metal key Grandpa Theodore had given me. Harrison took the key, adjusting his glasses to examine the serial number stamped onto its base. He typed the string of digits into his computer terminal. I watched his face closely. At first, his expression was neutral, the look of a man performing a task he had done 1,000 times before. Then his fingers froze on the keyboard. He leaned closer to the monitor, his brow furrowing. He typed another sequence of numbers, hitting the enter key with a sharp click. The silence in the office thickened. Harrison stared at the screen for a long moment. When he finally looked up at me, the polite customer service smile had completely vanished. His face was pale. The professional warmth was gone, replaced by a deadly, serious intensity that made my heart hammer. Harrison did not say a word. He stood up from his desk, walked past my chair, and went straight to his office door. He turned the deadbolt, sealing us inside. The heavy click echoed in the quiet room. He walked back, pulled the blinds shut over the glass partition, and returned to his desk. He did not sit down. Instead, he leaned heavily against the edge of the wood, gripping it with both hands. He looked me dead in the eye. "Miss," he said, his voice dropping to a low, urgent register. "You need to sit down." "I am already sitting," I replied, gripping the armrests of my leather chair. "What is going on? What did my grandfather leave in that box?" Harrison let out a heavy sigh, removing his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Your grandfather Theodore was a highly valued client for over 40 years. 5 years ago, he came to me to establish an airtight legal structure. He gave me strict instructions regarding this specific key. He told me that if you ever walk through those doors holding it, it meant the worst-case scenario had come to pass." Harrison opened a locked drawer in his desk and pulled out a thick envelope. The seal was unbroken, stamped with dark red wax. My grandfather's handwriting was scrolled across the front, spelling out my full name. Harrison placed the envelope on the desk directly in front of me. "Open it," he instructed. My hands shook as I reached for the thick paper. I broke the wax seal, tearing the flap open. Inside was a stack of heavy watermarked legal documents. I pulled them out and laid them flat on the desk. The first page had a bold heading printed across the top. It was a property deed. I scanned the legal jargon, searching for the core message. Then I saw the address. It was the exact address of the house I had just been evicted from. The house my parents claimed to manage for the estate. "I do not understand," I whispered, tracing the printed text. "Read the ownership clause," Harrison said quietly. I forced my eyes to focus. The document clearly stated that 100% of the property ownership had been transferred. It did not list my parents. It did not list an estate waiting in probate. It listed my name. Clara, sole owner and beneficiary. This cannot be right. I stammered. My parents told me the house belonged to the estate. They told me they were managing it. I have been paying them $3,000 a month in rent to cover property taxes and maintenance. They just evicted me yesterday for being 2 days late. Harrison's expression darkened his jaw, tightening with clear disgust. They lied to you. Clara, your grandfather knew they would try to control his assets, and he knew they would use you to do it. That is why he transferred the house directly to you 5 years ago. He placed the property into an irrevocable trust with you as the sole trustee and beneficiary. I shook my head, my mind struggling to process the sheer magnitude of the deception. It means your parents have absolutely zero legal claim to that house. Harrison explained, his voice razor sharp. They are not the landlords. They are not the estate managers. They are not authorized to collect a single dime from you. The property taxes have been fully paid off for the next decade through a separate reserve fund your grandfather established within the trust. That house is yours free and clear. It has been yours for 5 years. Air rushed out of my lungs. My vision blurred as the reality of his words slammed into me. I had not been living in my parents' property. I had been paying them rent to live in my own house. I had worked myself to the bone, sacrificed my sanity, and drained my emergency savings to hand over $3,000 every month for a fictional tax bill. They evicted me from my own property on Christmas morning. They threw my bags into the snow, all while illegally collecting rent on a home they had no legal right to touch. Harrison watched my realizations set in. He did not offer empty platitudes or generic apologies. He simply reached across the polished oak desk and tapped his index finger against a second, much thicker document resting at the bottom of the envelope. "There is more," he said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "Your grandfather was a brilliant businessman. Clara." He anticipated that Richard and Patricia would attempt some form of financial manipulation to safeguard your future. He mandated that the trust retain an independent firm to conduct a continuous forensic accounting of any assets tied to the family name. I have personally overseen these audits for the last 5 years. I pulled the heavy-bound report from the envelope. The cover page displayed the logo of a prominent Chicago financial investigation firm. My hands felt unnaturally cold as I flipped past the executive summary and went straight to the transaction logs. I needed to see exactly where my money had gone. For 48 months, I had dutifully wired $3,000 to an account my father explicitly labeled as the Theodore Estate Escrow. I found the ledger tracking those specific inbound transfers. The columns were meticulously detailed. I scanned the outgoing disbursement column, expecting to find records of local property taxes or insurance premiums. Instead, I found a clean, unbroken line of automatic outbound transfers, within 24 hours of my rent hitting the supposed estate account. The exact same amount was immediately wired out to a private limited liability company. I looked up at Harrison. "What is this LLC?" I asked, pointing to the alphanumeric string on the page. "Turn to page 42, Harrison replied. I flipped through the dense financial jargon until I reached the indicated page. It contained the corporate registration documents for the shell company. The sole managing director listed was my father, Richard. The registered address was a commercial post office box downtown. He created a shell company to launder my rent payments. I stated the words, tasting like ash in my mouth. Why go through all this trouble just to steal my money? Harrison leaned back in his leather chair. Keep reading. Clara, look at the operational expenses of that shell company. I traced my finger down the ledger on the next page. The LLC had exactly one recurring monthly expense. Every single month. A payment of $2,950 was wired directly to a major national mortgage lender. There were no other transactions. The shell company was nothing more than a funnel. It took my hard-earned money, skimmed $50 for account maintenance fees, and fired the rest straight into a mortgage payment. "Whose mortgage is this?" I demanded, my heart hammering against my ribs. I flipped to the appendix containing the property records. The address listed on the mortgage deed was not in Chicago. It was located in an ultra-exclusive gated community in the northern suburbs. I stared at the street name and house number. My vision tunneled. The air in the office suddenly felt too thin to breathe. It was Brittany and Jamal' new million-dollar mansion. The grand, sprawling estate they had purchased 3 years ago with a massive catered housewarming party. I remembered standing in their marble foyer holding a cheap bottle of wine I had barely been able to afford, listening to my parents loudly praise Jamal for being such an excellent provider. I remembered Brittany swirling her champagne glass, boasting about how she and Jamal had secured their dream home through smart investments and strict budgeting. The sheer unadulterated evil of their scheme hit me with the force of a freight train. I had not just been paying rent for a house I already owned. I had been paying the mortgage on my sister luxury mansion. Every time I worked a weekend shift. Every time I skipped a meal to save cash. Every time I panicked over my shrinking bank account. I was actively funding the golden child perfect suburban lifestyle. The sickening truth locked into place. Yesterday morning, when Brittany stood on my porch sipping her hot cocoa and mocking me for my poor financial planning, she was looking at the woman who literally paid for the roof over her head. She had watched our parents evict me into a blizzard for failing to subsidize her fraudulent existence. And Jamal. Jamal was a fiercely proud, self-made sales director who constantly preached about financial independence. He believed he was paying that mortgage. He believed his wife was managing their household budget with funds from a legitimate family trust. He had no idea his pristine suburban life was built on a foundation of felony fraud and the extortion of his sister-in-law. My parents had orchestrated a flawless parasitic ecosystem. They legally could not touch my house, so they weaponized my sense of duty to drain my income instead. They had absolutely zero legal right to my property. But they convinced me I was a tenant in my own home. They used my fear of eviction to guarantee a steady stream of income for their favorite daughter. They stole my money, funded her vanity, and then threw me away the very second I prioritized saving my nephew's life over lining their pockets. "You own the house," Clara Harrison said, breaking the heavy silence in the office. "You have the deed. Your parents are essentially trespassers who committed federal wire fraud. We can freeze the trust completely. But before you leave this bank, you need to check your other financial vulnerabilities. If they are willing to orchestrate a mortgage laundering scheme to fund your sister, they will not stop there. They have your social security number. They have access to your credit history. You need to verify every single account attached to your name right now." I closed the forensic accounting report and placed my hand flat against the leather cover. The sadness was entirely gone. The victim died. I stared at the closed report on the oak desk. The sadness was entirely gone. The victim died right there in that leather chair. I thanked Harrison for his discretion, gathered the heavy documents, and placed them carefully back into the thick envelope. My grandfather had given me the truth, and now it was my responsibility to weaponize it. But before I could launch any kind of counterattack, I needed a secure place to strategize. I had spent the night freezing in a Walmart parking lot. My bones ached. My clothes were wrinkled, and my mind was running on pure adrenaline. I needed a hot shower and a quiet hotel room. I walked out of the bank and stepped back into the freezing Chicago wind. The city bustled around me, oblivious to the absolute destruction of my family dynamic. I climbed into my cold sedan and drove a few blocks away to a modest business hotel. I parked in their loading zone, grabbed my purse, and walked up to the front desk. A young receptionist smiled warmly and asked for my identification and a credit card to secure the reservation. I pulled out my primary travel card and slid it across the marble counter. I mentally calculated my remaining bonus from work, knowing I had more than enough to cover a few nights. The receptionist inserted the chip into the terminal. She waited for a moment, then frowned slightly. She pulled the card out, wiped the chip on her sleeve, and inserted it again. "I am sorry, miss," she said, her voice dropping to a polite whisper. "It seems your card is being declined." I shook my head, assuming it was a simple fraud alert triggered by the uncharacteristic hotel booking on the day after Christmas. "That is strange," I replied. "Let me try a different one." I reached into my wallet and retrieved my secondary credit card. This was the emergency line of credit I had shared with my parents since my college days. They had insisted on keeping their names on the account for emergencies, though I had never used it for anything other than basic living expenses during my early 20s. I handed it to the receptionist. She processed the second card. The terminal beeped loudly. "I am incredibly sorry," she said, looking genuinely uncomfortable now. "This one is declining as well. The system is showing that the credit limit has been vastly exceeded." My blood ran cold. Exceeded. That was impossible. The limit on that emergency card was $20,000, and the balance had been sitting at zero for over 5 years. I snatched the card back from the counter, apologized to the confused receptionist, and practically ran back to my car. I locked the doors, turned on the engine for heat, and immediately dialed the customer service number on the back of the card. The automated system prompted me to enter my social security number. When the robotic voice read out my current balance, I thought I was having a stress-induced hallucination. "Your current balance is $15,420. Your available credit is zero. Your account is currently locked due to suspected fraudulent activity." I mashed the zero key until a live representative answered the phone. Her name was Nancy. I verified my identity, answering every security question with aggressive precision. "Nancy," I said, my voice trembling with suppressed rage, "I need you to tell me exactly what the charges on this account are. I have not used this card in half a decade." I heard her typing rapidly on her keyboard. "Let me pull up your transaction history." "Clara," she said, "it appears there was a sudden surge in activity starting late last night and continuing into the early hours of this morning. I am seeing multiple high-value charges. There is a charge for $5,000 at a luxury watch boutique. Another charge for $6,000 at a high-end designer boutique in downtown Chicago. $2,000 at a premium electronics retailer. And a final charge for hotel accommodations and spa services at a 5-star resort, totaling roughly $2,400. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the steering wheel. "Who authorized these charges?" I demanded. Nancy paused. "Well, the purchases were made using physical cards linked to the account. Let me check the user authorizations." She typed for another moment. The cards used were registered to Richard and Patricia. However, I am seeing an administrative change submitted just 3 hours ago. The authorized users Richard and Patricia initiated a formal release of liability through our automated system. They utilized a digital loophole to remove their names as co-signers on this specific credit line. Because you are listed as the primary account holder, the entire balance has defaulted entirely to you. I sat in the driver's seat, staring blankly at the frosted windshield. The sheer, terrifying magnitude of their malice washed over me. They did not just evict me. They did not just steal my rent money to pay for the luxury mansion of my sister. They were actively executing a scorched earth campaign against my financial identity. They knew that kicking me out into the snow would force me to look for a new apartment. They knew that any prospective landlord would run a background check and pull my credit score. By maxing out a dormant credit card with $15,000 in luxury purchases and dumping the debt squarely on my shoulders. They were intentionally tanking my credit utilization ratio. They were destroying my credit score in real time. I thanked Nancy and ended the call, The cold silence inside my vehicle was overwhelming. This was not a simple family dispute over delayed payment. This was a calculated financial assassination. I shifted the sedan into drive. I needed my corporate laptop back. It was time to return to the property that legally belonged to me. I drove. I navigated the icy streets back to the suburbs. The drive took 45 minutes. I pulled into the driveway of the house I had believed belonged to my grandfather's estate. The snow was still piled high on the front lawn, but their luxury vehicles were parked snugly inside. I killed the engine, grabbed my purse containing the envelope from Manager Harrison, and marched up the walkway. I did not bother ringing the doorbell. My key still worked. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped into the warm foyer. The sheer normality of the house felt grotesque. Holiday music played softly from the hidden speakers in the ceiling. The Christmas tree glittered in the living room, surrounded by discarded wrapping paper from yesterday morning. It was a picture-perfect scene of domestic bliss, carefully curated by the very people who had just saddled me with $15,000 of fraudulent debt. I ignored the festive decor and headed straight for the kitchen. I needed my corporate laptop. It held crucial supply chain data and forecasting models I needed for an emergency meeting next week. Leaving it in their possession was a massive security risk. I rounded the corner and stopped. My mother, Patricia, was sitting at the sprawling marble island. She wore a pristine cashmere sweater, her makeup flawlessly applied. A steaming cup of tea rested in front of her. She was casually scrolling through a tablet, looking completely relaxed. She looked up as my boots clicked against the hardwood floor. A flicker of irritation crossed her face, quickly replaced by an expression of supreme boredom. "I thought your father told you to leave the premises." "Clara," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Rearing here uninvited is trespassing. If you came begging for a loan or a place to sleep, you are wasting your breath. We already discussed this. You need to learn independence. Actions have consequences." "I need my work laptop," I demanded, keeping my voice dangerously level. It was on the desk in the guest room. "I am taking it, and then we are going to talk about the $15,000 of luxury shopping you just dumped onto my emergency credit card." Patricia took a sip of her tea, completely unfazed. "Your laptop is locked in your father's study," she replied smoothly. "He will return it to you once we confirm you have not caused any damage to our property. As for your credit card, I have no idea what you are talking about. You are the primary account holder. If you went on a spending spree to cope with your eviction, that is your financial burden to manage. We simply removed ourselves from the account to protect our own credit scores from your reckless behavior." The blatant, effortless lying was breathtaking. I walked slowly toward the marble island, unzipping my purse. I did not yell. I did not scream. I pulled the heavy envelope from the bank out of my bag and withdrew the copy of the property deed. I slammed the document flat onto the marble surface right next to her delicate teacup. "I went to the bank this morning," I said, my voice echoing in the large kitchen. "I spoke with Manager Harrison. I saw the forensic accounting report. I know everything. Mom, I know about the irrevocable trust Grandpa Theodore set up 5 years ago. I know you and Dad are not the estate managers. I know this house belongs entirely to me, free and clear with the property taxes prepaid for the next decade." Patricia glanced down at the deed, her eyes scanning the bold print. She did not even flinch. I leaned forward, placing both hands on the cool marble, invading her personal space. "I know my $3,000 in rent was never used for this property." I continued enunciating every single syllable. "I know Dad set up a shell company to funnel my hard-earned money directly to a mortgage lender. I know I have been secretly funding the mortgage on Brittany and Jamal million-dollar mansion in the suburbs. You stole my money. You defrauded me. And then you evicted me from my own house on Christmas morning because I used my savings to pay for your grandson emergency room visit instead of lining your pockets." I waited for the panic. I expected the color to drain from her face. I braced myself for the stuttering denials, the desperate backpedaling, or even a sudden display of fake maternal tears to manipulate her way out of the corner. I had laid out undeniable proof of their grand deception. I had stripped away their entire illusion of wealth and control. Patricia picked up her teacup. She took another slow, deliberate sip. She set the cup back down on the saucer with a soft clink. She folded her hands neatly in her lap, looked up at me, and smiled. It was not a nervous smile. It was the smug, triumphant grin of a predator who had just watched its prey walk willingly into a trap. You really think you are the smartest person in the room? Do not you, Clara, she said, her voice practically purring with satisfaction. You think a single visit to an old bank manager changes anything. You think you can just march in here, slap a 5-year-old piece of paper on my counter, and take control. She reached over and casually pushed the deed back toward me. Her absolute lack of fear sent a sudden icy spike of adrenaline straight through my veins. I stared at her, my mind racing to process her reaction. You cannot deny this, I stated, pointing at the document. The bank has the original. The trust is ironclad. You are illegally occupying my property. Patricia let out a soft, mocking laugh. Oh, sweetie, she said, her eyes flashing with cruel amusement. We are not occupying your property. We are occupying our property. Before I could process Patricia's bizarre statement, a deep, booming laugh echoed from the hallway. Heavy footsteps approached the kitchen. My father, Richard, strolled into the room. He was dressed in a pristine golf polo and tailored slacks, looking completely unbothered by the fact that he had kicked his daughter into a blizzard 24 hours prior. He held a manila folder in his right hand. He walked up to the marble island, stood beside my mother, and dropped the folder right on top of my grandfather's deed. You always were a step behind. Clara, Richard said, his voice laced with patronizing pity. You march in here acting like a corporate conqueror, waving a 5-year-old piece of paper around. Did you really think you were the only one who knew how to play this game? I stared at the manila folder. A cold knot formed in my stomach. What is that? I demanded, refusing to let my voice shake. Patricia took another sip of her tea, gesturing gracefully toward the folder. Go ahead, darling. Open it. Read it carefully. I reached out and flipped the cover open. Inside was a single legally binding document. The header was printed in bold black ink. Quitclaim deed. My eyes darted across the text. It was a standard legal form used to transfer interest in real property. The property address listed was the exact house we were standing in. The grantor was listed as Clara. The grantees were listed as Richard and Patricia. I skipped to the bottom of the page. Sitting right above the notary stamp was a signature. My signature. I felt the blood drain from my face. I stared at the cursive loops the specific way the C curved into the L. It looked incredibly similar to my handwriting. It was a damn good replication, but I knew with absolute certainty that I had never signed this paper. The date stamped next to the signature was from exactly 3 years ago. This is a forgery, I stated flatly, looking up at my father. I never signed a quitclaim deed. I never transferred ownership of this house to you. This is fake. Richard threw his head back and laughed, a rich booming sound that made my skin crawl. A forgery. He chuckled, looking at Patricia. Oh, Clara, your memory really is deteriorating. You do not remember signing it. I stood my ground. Do not play these psychological games with me. I did not sign this document, and no legitimate notary would have stamped it without me being present with identification. You are committing massive fraud. Patricia sighed dramatically. You always had a problem with alcohol at family events. She said, her tone dripping with fake maternal concern. Do you not remember Thanksgiving 3 years ago? You drank half a bottle of wine before dinner was even served? You were crying about how stressed you were at work, complaining about the responsibilities of home ownership. You begged your father to take the burden off your shoulders. We brought the paperwork out and you signed it willingly right here at this very kitchen island. Our friend from the country club, a licensed notary, was attending the dinner. He witnessed the entire thing. The sheer velocity of their gaslighting left me speechless. They had constructed an entire fictional narrative, complete with a fake timeline, fake emotional breakdowns, and a corrupt notary who was clearly on their payroll or manipulated into compliance. They were attempting to overwrite my reality. They wanted me to doubt my own mind, to question my own memory. But I knew the truth. I barely drank. I despised wine. I had never cried to them about the burdens of a house I did not even know I legally owned at the time. Did you think we were stupid enough not to know? The old man gave you the house? Richard snarled, his jovial mask slipping to reveal the ruthless predator beneath. We knew about the irrevocable trust the moment Theodore filed the paperwork. He thought he could outsmart us. He thought he could hand $1 million asset to a naive girl and bypass us entirely. We let you believe we were managing it. We let you pay the mortgage for your sister, and we waited until we had the perfect opportunity to correct his mistake. It is ours now. I looked down at the forged quitclaim deed. The danger of my situation crystallized. They were not just terrible parents. They were highly organized, motivated criminals playing a desperate game. By producing this document, they escalated a family dispute into a treacherous legal battlefield. They had a corrupt notary. They had a plausible, albeit fabricated story. If I went to the police right now, it would be my word against theirs. And they had a stamped legal document backing their claim. The authorities would treat it as a civil dispute, a messy family lawsuit that could drag on in court for years. My mind raced, evaluating strategic variables. I was cornered in my own kitchen. If I fought them here, screaming and making threats, I would play right into their narrative. I would look exactly like the unstable, aggressive, drunken daughter they were describing. They wanted me to lose control. They wanted me to panic. The forged deed was a massive obstacle, but it was also a massive risk on their part. Forging a property deed and utilizing a fraudulent notary was a felony. If I could prove the signature was fake, they would not just lose the house. They would go to prison. You are playing a dangerous game, I said carefully, modulating my voice to remain completely steady and devoid of emotion. Richard leaned across the marble island, his eyes cold and hard. We are not playing a game. Clara, we already won. You are trespassing on our own property. You have 5 seconds to leave before we call the police and have you arrested for breaking and entering. I stood my ground, my boots planted firmly on the floor. I am not leaving, I said, crossing my arms to hide the slight tremor in my hands. This is my house. I have the original legally binding deed secured in a private bank vault, and your fraudulent piece of paper does not change the reality of my ownership. I am going to walk upstairs, retrieve my corporate laptop, and then call the authorities to report your forgery. Richard did not move to block my path, which should have been my first warning. He simply leaned back against the counter and smirked, folding his arms in a mirror image of my posture. He glanced at my mother and gave a subtle nod. Patricia did not argue. She calmly reached into the pocket of her cashmere sweater, pulled out her smartphone, and tapped the screen 3 times. She held the device to her ear. Her entire demeanor shifted in a fraction of a second. The smug predator vanished instantly, replaced by a trembling, terrified housewife. "Yes, hello," Patricia said, her voice shaking with perfectly manufactured panic. "I need police assistance immediately. A former tenant has broken into our home." She used an old key. Yes, she is still here. She is becoming highly aggressive and erratic. We evicted her yesterday and now she refuses to leave. She is making threats against my husband and me. Please hurry. We are terrified. I stared at her, paralyzed by the sociopathic ease with which she weaponized the emergency dispatch system. She provided our address, her voice cracking in all the right places, painting a vivid picture of an unhinged intruder terrorizing a helpless older couple. My analytical mind kicked into overdrive, calculating the consequences of her call. I knew exactly how this scenario would play out. The police would walk into this luxurious suburban home. They would see Richard and Patricia, two affluent, well-dressed older citizens, claiming they were in danger. Then they would look at me. I was running on zero sleep, wearing wrinkled clothes from freezing in a Walmart parking lot, vibrating with barely suppressed rage. Worse, my parents had a stamped notarized quitclaim deed sitting on the kitchen island. The police are not forensic document examiners. They are dispatched to keep the peace and resolve domestic disturbances. Presented with a notarized deed showing my parents as the legal owners, the officers would ask zero questions about irrevocable trusts. They would ask me to step outside. If I argued or tried to explain the web of financial fraud and mortgage laundering, they would view me as a hostile trespasser. They would put me in handcuffs. An arrest record, even a misdemeanor for trespassing, would trigger an immediate alert in my company human resources system. As a supply chain analyst handling sensitive vendor contracts, my corporate security clearance required a pristine criminal record. An arrest would mean an automatic suspension followed by swift termination. Without my job, I would have zero income. Without income, I could not hire the legal representation required to dismantle their fraud. By dialing 911, Patricia was executing a flawless tactical strike against my livelihood. Sirens began to wail in the far distance, the high-pitched sound cutting through the quiet winter morning. The police were on their way. I had less than 2 minutes. I did not waste a second screaming. I spun around and sprinted toward the grand staircase. Richard yelled behind me, his heavy footsteps pounding against the floorboards. But I was faster. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my boots digging into the carpet. I reached the guest room, threw the door open, and lunged for the desk. My corporate laptop was sitting exactly where I had left it on Christmas Eve. I grabbed the heavy device, snatching the power cord and throwing both into my large leather purse. I grabbed my backup hard drive, shoving it into the bag until the zipper barely closed. I bolted out of the room just as Richard reached the top of the stairs. He lunged for my arm, his face red with anger, but I ducked under his grasp and shoved past him. I scrambled down the staircase, gripping the banister to keep from falling. I hit the foyer, running. Patricia was standing by the front door, holding her phone, looking intensely satisfied with her handiwork. The sound of approaching sirens was louder now, echoing down the snowy street. I stopped with my hand hovering over the brass doorknob. I looked at the 2 people who had spent my entire life draining my spirit and who had spent the last 4 years draining my bank account. "You just made the biggest mistake of your miserable lives," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute freezing certainty. I threw the front door open and sprinted down the icy walkway. The flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser reflected off the snow at the end of the block. I threw myself into my sedan, slammed the key into the ignition, and threw the car into reverse. I backed out of the driveway so fast my tires spun and kicked up a spray of snow. I hit the gas, speeding in the opposite direction just as the cruiser turned onto the street. I drove for miles without looking back, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I merged onto the highway, watching the suburban illusion finally fade away in my rearview mirror. The adrenaline slowly began to recede, leaving behind a cold and hard clarity. My parents were completely devoid of conscience. They had the forged paperwork. They had the corrupt notary. They had the police on their side. I could never fight them with logic because sociopaths do not operate within the bounds of logic or morality. I could only fight them with the harsh, unforgiving power of the law. I needed a lawyer who was just as ruthless as they were. I parked my sedan in a coffee shop parking lot, my hands still gripping the steering wheel. I was safe from the immediate threat of arrest, but I was entirely locked out of my own home, and my finances were in ruins. I opened my laptop, connected to the public wireless network, and logged into my employee retirement portal. I had a small 401k from my first corporate job, completely separate from my current company accounts. It held roughly $40,000. Liquidating it meant eating a massive penalty and paying heavy taxes. But I was out of options. I clicked the button to initiate a hardship withdrawal, requesting an expedited wire transfer to my checking account. I needed liquid capital, and I needed it immediately. Next, I ran a search for the most ruthless real estate litigation attorneys in Chicago. I did not want a family lawyer or a mediator. I wanted a shark. One name dominated the legal forums and professional reviews: Donovan. He was a former federal prosecutor who specialized in high-stakes property fraud. His retainer was exorbitant, but his reputation for utterly destroying his courtroom opponents was exactly what I required. I called his office, explained the urgency of my situation involving a forged deed and an irrevocable trust, and secured an emergency consultation for the following afternoon. 24 hours later, I walked into Donovan's sleek downtown office. The space was intimidating, featuring dark wood paneling and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Donovan sat behind a massive glass desk. He was in his late 40s, wearing a tailored charcoal suit with piercing blue eyes that evaluated me in a fraction of a second. He did not offer empty pleasantries. He gestured to the leather chair opposite him and told me to lay out my case. I placed the thick envelope from Manager Harrison onto the glass surface. I pulled out the true deed, the forensic accounting report, and a printed copy of the forged quitclaim deed that I had managed to download from the county public records database the previous night. I explained the eviction, the stolen rent money funding my sister mansion, the $15,000 of credit card debt, and the weaponized police call. Donovan listened in absolute silence, his eyes darting across the documents as I spoke. When I finished, Donovan picked up the printed copy of the quitclaim deed my parents had filed with the county. He studied the signature, then compared it to my actual signature on my driver license. A sharp, humorless smile touched the corners of his mouth. "This is an amateur job," Donovan said, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who dealt with criminals every single day. "Look at the pressure points on the cursive loops. Your natural signature flows with fluid, continuous momentum. This forgery has hesitation marks. The person who signed this was moving slowly, deliberately, trying to copy the shape of your letters rather than writing them naturally. Furthermore, the notary stamp belongs to a man whose license was flagged last year for suspicious property transfers. Your parents found a corrupt official willing to rubber stamp a fraudulent document. This alone is a felony." I felt a surge of validation. "Then we take this to the police," I urged, leaning forward in my chair. "We show them the trust documents and we press charges for forgery. We get them out of my house today." Donovan shook his head, tossing the fake deed back onto the desk. "No, we do not. If we strike right now, your parents will immediately hire a defense attorney and claim it is a civil family dispute. They will argue that you gave verbal consent or that the trust conditions were misunderstood. They will drag this out in probate and civil court for 3 to 5 years. During that entire time, they will continue living in your house, depleting its value, while you drown in legal fees, fighting a prolonged battle. The police will refuse to intervene in what looks like a messy inheritance fight." I frowned, frustration bubbling up in my chest. "So, we just let them get away with it. I cannot just sit by and let them steal my property and destroy my credit. I need them out. I need them held accountable for everything they have done to me." Donovan leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "We are not letting them get away with anything, Clara. But you are thinking too small. Forging a deed is a serious crime. But people do not risk federal prison just to secure a free place to live. Your parents already had free housing. You are paying them $3,000 a month. There is absolutely no logical reason for them to take the massive legal risk of forging a property transfer unless they needed the house for something much bigger. We have to dig deeper. Clara, we need to find out exactly why they forged this deed in the first place. There has to be a larger financial motive hidden beneath the surface. Real estate fraud of this specific nature is always driven by a desperate need for massive, immediate liquidity. I guarantee you they leveraged your property. We just have to follow the paper trail to find out how. I took a deep breath, absorbing the brutal truth of his logic. They had not just stolen my home. They turned it into a financial weapon. If they took out a loan against the property, they were playing with hundreds of thousands of dollars. Donovan pulled a fresh legal pad from his drawer and uncapped a silver fountain pen. He looked at me with cold, calculating precision. We are going to rip their finances apart piece by piece, he stated. We will uncover every hidden bank account and fraudulent transaction. Once we have the complete picture, we will not just evict them. We will dismantle their entire lives. Our retaliation begins today. The next 3 days were an exhausting blur of caffeine and towering stacks of legal documents. I basically moved into the conference room of my lawyer, trading my corporate supply chain spreadsheets for county property records and banking ledgers. We hired a private investigator who specialized in uncovering hidden financial assets. Donovan was relentless. He operated with a level of cold precision that made me incredibly grateful he was on my side. We filed expedited discovery requests and leveraged every contact he had in the Chicago financial sector. I watched him work the phones with absolute unquestionable authority and power. His voice was a low, commanding rumble as he pulled favors and demanded expedited processing from title companies and county clerks. My parents thought they were clever, but they left a digital footprint a mile wide. On Thursday evening, the breakthrough finally arrived. The city was battered by another winter storm, the wind howling against the thick glass of the office windows. But inside, the atmosphere was electric. Donovan walked into the conference room holding a fresh stack of papers. His sharp blue eyes gleamed with a predatory satisfaction. He tossed a thick, staple-bound document onto the mahogany table. You were right to trust your instincts, Clara, he said, pulling out a chair and sitting down opposite me. They did not forge that quitclaim deed just to secure free housing. They used your property as a personal cash machine. Look at page 4. I opened the heavy document. It was a commercial loan agreement from a major national bank. The property address listed as collateral was my house. The borrowers listed were Richard and Patricia. I traced my finger down the page until I reached the principal loan amount. My breath caught in my throat. I looked back up. $500,000, I read aloud, my voice barely above a whisper. They took out a $500,000 loan against my house. It is a home equity line of credit, Donovan corrected, tapping the header of the document. A HELOC. Your grandfather paid off the house entirely, which meant the property had massive equity. Your parents knew this. They filed the forged quitclaim deed with the county to establish themselves as the legal owners on paper. Once the county records were updated, they walked into this bank, presented the fraudulent deed, and applied for maximum revolving credit. They applied for a maximum equity line of credit against the paid-off asset. The bank, seeing a pristine property with zero existing mortgage debt rubber, stamped a $500,000 revolving credit line. I stared at the staggering numbers on the page. The sheer audacity of their crime was difficult to comprehend. They had literally stolen the financial foundation of my home. If they default on this, I realized panic rising in my chest. If they stop making the monthly interest payments, the bank will foreclose on the house. They will take my property to satisfy the massive debt. Exactly. Donovan said, his tone deadly serious. Your parents gambled your entire inheritance to secure a massive injection of liquid cash. They bet everything on the assumption that you would never discover the trust, or that if you did, You would be too intimidated to fight them. But how did the bank not verify the signature I demanded, anger overriding the panic? How did they not check the original trust documents? Banks rely on county records and notarized signatures. Donovan explained smoothly. Your parents used a corrupt notary to stamp the fake quitclaim deed. Once that deed was officially recorded by the county clerk, it became the official public record. The bank underwriter simply pulled the county file, saw your parents listed as the owners, and processed the loan. It was a highly coordinated, premeditated scheme. I leaned back in my chair, the magnitude of the situation settling over me. We are not just talking about an illegal eviction anymore. No, we are not, Donovan stated, leaning forward and resting his arms on the table. Forging a deed to steal a house is a state-level crime. But the exact moment your parents used that forged document to extract the $500,000 from a federally insured financial institution, they crossed a massive, irreversible line. This is federal bank fraud. Because they received the funds via electronic wire transfer, it is also federal wire fraud. Each of these charges carries a maximum penalty of 20 to 30 years in federal prison. Prison. The word hung heavy in the quiet conference room. I pictured my status-obsessed mother with her cashmere sweaters and country club lunches, trading her luxury lifestyle for a federal jumpsuit. I pictured my highly demanding father, who always prided himself on his strict corporate authority, sitting behind bulletproof glass in a visitation room. For a brief second, the ingrained daughterly conditioning flared up, whispering that this was too far, that sending my parents to federal prison was an unforgivable escalation. But then I remembered the freezing snow on Christmas morning. I remembered Patricia sipping tea while watching me dig my ruined clothes out of a snowdrift. I remembered Richard threatening to have me arrested for trespassing in my own home. They had shown me zero mercy. They had cheerfully saddled me with crushing financial debt to simply ensure I would be too incredibly poor to ever fight back. They are felons, I said, my voice hardening. They stole $500,000 using my name and my property. They are felons, Donovan agreed. And this changes our entire strategy. We do not need to fight a slow battle in civil court over the property deed. We have the leverage to completely obliterate them. If we present this evidence to the Bank Fraud Investigation Department, they will refer the case to the FBI. But before we pull the trigger, we must know exactly where that money went, he said, his eyes locking onto my steady, furious gaze. I nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of his words. The bank fraud investigators would want a complete, undeniably clear paper trail before they escalated a family dispute into a federal indictment. We needed to map every single dollar of that $500,000. Donovan called in his lead forensic accountant, a sharp-eyed woman who looked at bank ledgers the way a surgeon looks at an X-ray. They set up a secure projection screen at the end of the conference table. For the next 8 hours, we did not leave that room. We ordered black coffee and stale sandwiches, our eyes burning from staring at the glowing spreadsheets. The initial extraction of the funds was shockingly straightforward. Richard and Patricia had authorized a direct wire transfer of $500,000 from the newly opened home equity line of credit into their primary joint checking account. They did not even try to hide the initial deposit. But the disbursement of those funds was a masterclass in frantic, desperate money laundering. "Let us follow your father first," Donovan commanded, tapping a laser pointer against a cluster of outbound wire transfers. Richard had moved exactly $200,000 within 48 hours of receiving the bank loan. He did not move it into a savings account or a legitimate investment portfolio. Instead, the money was broken down into a dozen smaller transactions deliberately structured to stay just under the federal reporting thresholds. The destination accounts were traced to offshore holding companies and obscure payment processors. I stared at the names of the receiving entities. They made no sense. They were not vendors associated with my father's corporate firm. The accountant typed furiously, running the routing numbers through a proprietary financial database. A grim smile crossed her face. "These are not business vendors," she stated, pulling up the registration data. "These are shell companies operated by high-stakes offshore sportsbooks and underground gambling syndicates. Your father is not just a casual gambler. He is in deep. He owed them a massive amount of money." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Richard, the man who constantly lectured me on fiscal responsibility, the man who evicted me for a 2-day delay on a rent payment, was a degenerate gambling addict. He had leveraged my property and risked federal prison because the bookies were likely closing in on him. His entire persona of strict corporate authority was a pathetic, crumbling facade built over a black hole of debt. He did not evict me to teach me a lesson. He evicted me because he was desperate, drowning in his own reckless vices, and I was just an asset he needed to liquidate. "That accounts for $200,000, Donovan said, his voice cutting through my shock. "But we still have $300,000 missing. Where did the rest of the federal loan go?" The accountant brought up the next set of transactions. These transfers were not hidden offshore. They were wired domestically straight from my parents' joint account into a personal checking account at a completely different bank. The name on the receiving account made my blood boil. Brittany. My sister had received $300,000 in stolen federal funds over the course of 6 months. We pulled up Brittany bank statements obtained through Donovan expedited discovery channels. I watched in absolute disgust as her spending habits were projected onto the large screen. There were no investments. There was no savings strategy. The money was being hemorrhaged at a sickening pace to fund an illusion. I saw $5,000 charges at luxury auto dealerships to lease her imported sports car. I saw $10,000 invoices from exclusive country clubs. There were relentless daily charges at high-end designer boutiques, luxury cosmetic surgeons, and elite 5-star resorts. She was burning through my stolen home equity to finance her fake social media influencer lifestyle. I pulled out my phone and opened her social media profile. Her feed was a curated stream of perfection. There were photos of her posing with designer handbags captioned with quotes about hard work and the hustle mindset. There were videos of her sipping champagne at private galas, boasting about her financial independence and giving advice on building generational wealth. The sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy was nauseating. She was playing the role of a successful, self-made suburban elite, while secretly functioning as a parasite feeding off a felony bank fraud scheme engineered by our parents. Donovan walked around the table, standing behind my chair as he looked at the projected statements. She spent $300,000 of stolen money on vanity. He observed coldly. This is not a family struggling to make ends meet. This is a syndicate of narcissists funding their delusions with your stolen property. If we hand this over to the federal authorities right now, they will freeze all of these accounts. They will seize the cars, the designer goods, and the country club memberships. But we need to be strategic about the collateral damage. I kept staring at Brittany financial records. A sudden sharp detail caught my eye. I noticed the name on her checking account. It was a single account. Jamal's name was not listed anywhere on the incoming wire transfers or the luxury purchases. I scrolled back to the top of the banking profile. Jamal, her hard-working husband, maintained completely separate finances. He deposited his salary into a different institution entirely to cover their massive mortgage and household bills. He does not know. I whispered the realization, sending a surge of electricity through my veins. Jamal has absolutely no idea where her money is coming from. He thinks she has a legitimate trust fund. He thinks her influencer sponsorships pay for her lifestyle. Brittany and my parents have completely isolated him from the fraud. Donovan narrowed his eyes, sensing the shift in my posture. You are thinking of a different angle. I looked at my ruthless attorney and smiled. The pieces of the puzzle were forming a devastating picture. My parents and my sister had built a wall of lies, but they left one glaring vulnerability. That vulnerability was my brother-in-law, Jamal. I pointed directly at the separate banking profile on the projection screen. Jamal is innocent in all of this. I told Donovan, tracing the legitimate lines of Jamal's salary deposits. He has no idea his wife is a felon, and he definitely has no idea his suburban life is subsidized by stolen funds. Donovan raised an eyebrow. Are you certain about that? Clara spouses usually know when $500,000 magically appears. I shook my head with conviction. You have to understand who Jamal is. I explained. Jamal is a self-made man in every sense of the word. He is an African-American sales director who clawed his way up the corporate ladder through sheer grit, working twice as hard to secure his executive position. He prides himself on his relentless work ethic and strict financial independence. He insists on paying his own way and refuses handouts. He pays the massive mortgage on their house using his own hard-earned salary. He covers all their household expenses. He genuinely believes he is providing an honest life for his family. So, how does Brittany explain the luxury cars and shopping sprees? Donovan asked. A man that smart has to notice his wife is spending hundreds of thousands of dollars while contributing nothing to the bills. She lied to him. I stated simply. When they first got married, Brittany told Jamal our parents had set up a massive legitimate trust fund for her. She convinced him that her lavish influencer lifestyle was entirely funded by generational wealth. Jamal, being a trusting husband, believed her. He respected what he thought were her private family assets and kept his finances completely separate. He never asked to audit her bank accounts because he trusted his wife. He trusted my parents. He bought into their entire illusion of old money. Donovan leaned back, a low whistle escaping his lips. That is a dangerous game. She isolated her fraudulent cash flow to prevent her husband from asking questions. Exactly, I agreed. Brittany and my parents deliberately walled Jamal off from their financial crimes. They knew if a man with his strict moral compass ever saw the actual origin of that money, he would be completely disgusted. He despises liars and thieves. If he knew his wife was funneling stolen home equity through a shell company created by his father-in-law, he would walk out the door immediately. I stared at the spreadsheets on the screen, clarity washing over me. For a brief moment, I considered handing the entire forensic report over to federal authorities and letting the chips fall where they may. The FBI would raid their home, freeze their assets, and drag everyone into a massive federal indictment. But if I did that, Jamal would be caught in the crossfire. His accounts would be frozen. His reputation in the corporate sales world would be tarnished. He would be blindsided, humiliated, and financially ruined by a crime he had zero part in committing. I refused to let an innocent man become collateral damage. Allowing authorities to handle the situation quietly would deprive me of the personal justice I required. My parents and sister had humiliated me. They evicted me on Christmas morning, dumped fraudulent debt onto my credit profile, and weaponized the police against me to protect their stolen luxury. Sending them to prison was the ultimate goal. But I wanted them to experience the exact same public destruction they had inflicted upon me. Jamal deserves the truth, I declared, locking eyes with Donovan. He deserves to know his marriage is built on a foundation of felony wire fraud. And we are going to be the ones to give him that truth. Donovan steepled his fingers, a shark-like grin spreading across his face. You want to use the husband as the detonator. You want him to tear the family apart from the inside before the federal agents even knock on their door. He is the catalyst. I confirmed, my voice ringing with icy determination. Brittany cares about her social status and her pristine image more than anything else in the world. Jamal is her trophy husband. He validates her existence. If we present this forensic accounting report directly to him, the illusion shatters. He will not just leave her. He will completely reject her and everything she stands for. He will become our greatest ally in dismantling their lives. We separate the innocent from the guilty. and we let Brittany watch her entire world burn to the ground because of her own lies. It is a brilliant tactical maneuver. Donovan agreed, making a sharp note on his legal pad. We isolate the targets. We remove their only remaining pillar of legitimate financial stability. But we cannot mail him these documents. If Brittany intercepts the package, she will spin another web of lies to gaslight him. We need a guaranteed delivery method. We need an environment where she cannot hide, where she cannot run, and where she is forced to answer for her crimes in real time. I need to confront him in person, I said, organizing the logistics of the ambush. I need to look him in the eye and hand him the undeniable proof of his wife deception. I need to do it when she is surrounded by the very people she has been trying to impress. We need a stage, Donovan concluded, closing the forensic ledger with a snap. We need to find the perfect moment to execute this operation. I smiled coldly. The final critical piece of the strategy was sliding seamlessly into place. I knew exactly when and where the execution would happen. I knew exactly how to make their sudden downfall absolutely spectacular and complete. I smiled coldly at Donovan as the final piece of our strategy clicked into place. I knew exactly when and where we would execute our strike. Brittany and Jamal were hosting an enormous, ultra-exclusive New Year Eve party at their suburban mansion. It was not just a casual get-together. It was a massive networking event masked as a holiday celebration. Jamal was inviting all of his top-tier corporate partners, regional sales directors, and high net worth clients. My parents were using the event to showcase their fake wealth to their country club associates. Brittany had been boasting about this party on her social media for months, hyping it up as the social event of the season. She had hired a private catering company, a professional bartender, and a string quartet. The entire house would be packed with the exact people they spent their lives trying to impress. It was the absolute perfect stage to burn their illusions to the ground. If we confronted them in a quiet office, they would lie, deny, and manipulate their way out. If we confronted them in front of the local elite, there would be nowhere left to hide. Donovan did not waste a single second. He immediately mobilized his entire legal team to prepare the ultimate arsenal. The conference room transformed into a war room. First, he drafted the federal lawsuit outlining the bank fraud, wire fraud, and the forged quitclaim deed. He compiled a towering stack of evidence, including the forensic accounting report, the true irrevocable trust documents, and the detailed paper trail tracking my stolen rent money straight into Brittany's checking account. Next, he prepared the formal eviction notices for my parents. He made sure the language was merciless, demanding immediate vacating of my property due to criminal trespass and felony fraud. But the most crucial step was contacting the fraud investigation unit at the national bank that issued the home equity line of credit. Donovan utilized a Heil contact within their corporate security division. He presented them with the undeniable proof that their $500,000 loan was secured using a forged document. The bank investigators were absolutely furious. Banks do not take kindly to being defrauded out of $500,000. They immediately assigned a senior investigator to our case, working directly with Donovan to coordinate the freezing of my parents' and sister financial assets. With the paperwork ready, Donovan presented me with a choice. He leaned across the mahogany table, looking at me with intense focus. We have enough evidence to hand this over to the federal authorities right now, he explained. We can file the lawsuit quietly, have the bank freeze their accounts, and let the FBI knock on their door next week. That is the standard protocol. It is clean and quiet. I shook my head fiercely. Absolutely not. If we file quietly, they will use that silence to their advantage. Patricia will call every family member and country club friend to spin a narrative where I am the villain. She will claim I am a jealous, unstable daughter trying to ruin them. Richard will use his remaining corporate contacts to hide whatever cash he has left or attempt to flee the jurisdiction. And Brittany will gaslight Jamal, crying fake tears and blaming the entire mortgage fraud on my parents to save her own marriage. I cannot allow them the opportunity to control the narrative. They evicted me into a freezing blizzard on Christmas morning and threw my clothes into a snowdrift. They laughed at my misery. I do not want a quiet legal proceeding. I want a public execution of their lies. I want their reputation destroyed in front of the very people they sacrificed me to impress. Donovan smiled, a sharp and predatory expression that mirrored my own determination. He completely agreed with me. He contacted a highly specialized process server, a man known for executing document deliveries in difficult or hostile environments. He also arranged for the bank's senior fraud investigator to accompany us to the party. The investigator wanted to be present to formally notify Richard and Patricia that their accounts were frozen and the federal authorities were stepping in. We spent the next 2 days rehearsing the confrontation. We anticipated their reactions, their lies, and their attempts to deflect. I memorized the key financial figures and the dates of their fraudulent transfers. I was not going to let emotion cloud my judgment. I needed to be as cold and calculating as a machine. On the afternoon of New Year Eve, I went shopping. I did not buy a sparkling party dress or anything remotely festive. I purchased a sharp-tailored charcoal gray power suit. It was the kind of outfit you wear into a corporate boardroom when you are about to orchestrate a hostile takeover. I paired it with black stiletto heels and a crisp white blouse. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, severe style. Looking in the mirror, I did not recognize the exhausted, shivering woman who had been kicked out of her own home just a week prior. I looked like a woman who was about to dismantle an entire family syndicate. As the sun set on the final day of the year, I met Donovan, the process server, and the bank investigator in the lobby of his office building. We climbed into a sleek black SUV and headed toward the affluent northern suburbs. The drive was silent, the tension in the vehicle thick and electric. I watched the snow-covered streets blur past the window, my heart beating with a steady, rhythmic intensity. I was returning to the million-dollar mansion. My blood and sweat had paid for. The trap was fully set. The evidence was ironclad. And the countdown to midnight was about to become the countdown to their absolute destruction. The black SUV glided smoothly through the wrought iron gates of the exclusive suburban neighborhood, crunching softly over the freshly cleared pavement. Up ahead, Brittany and Jamal Mansion blazed with light against the dark winter sky. The sheer scale of the property was staggering. Valet in crisp uniforms jogged back and forth across the circular driveway, expertly maneuvering a fleet of luxury vehicles, sleek sports cars, European sedans, and massive SUVs. I recognized several license plates belonging to the most influential members of my parents' country club. Through the massive front windows, I could see the glittering chandeliers and the silhouettes of dozens of guests mingling with crystal champagne flutes in their hands. Faint strains of a live string quartet drifted out into the freezing night air, mingling with the low hum of expensive engines. We pulled to a stop just past the valet stand. Donovan turned off the engine, but did not immediately unlock the doors. He looked at me in the rearview mirror, his blue eyes sharp and assessing. The bank fraud investigator, a stern man named Miller, sat quietly in the passenger seat, clutching a thick leather briefcase. Next to me sat Stone, the licensed process server, who looked entirely unfazed by the opulence surrounding us. This was his element, delivering devastating legal consequences to people who thought their wealth made them untouchable. I smoothed the lapels of my charcoal gray Powers suit. My heart pounded a relentless rhythm against my ribs, but my hands were completely steady. I was finally ready. Donovan unlocked the doors. We stepped out into the biting cold, simultaneously moving as a synchronized, formidable unit. A young valet rushed forward, reaching for the door handle, but Donovan waved him away with a sharp flick of his wrist. We bypassed the standard guest entrance and marched directly toward the massive double oak doors. My black stiletto heels clicked rhythmically against the stone walkway. A sharp metallic sound that cut through the soft murmur of the arriving guests. The heavy front doors were propped wide open, flanked by 2 private security guards hired specifically for the event. One of the guards stepped forward, raising his hand to check our invitations. But Donovan flashed a highly official-looking federal identification badge that belonged to Miller. The guard hesitated, his eyes darting between the badge and our severe expressions. He wisely took a step back, allowing us to pass without a single word of protest. We crossed the threshold and stepped into the grand marble foyer. The heat of the house washed over me, carrying the scent of expensive catering and high-end perfume. The foyer led directly into a sprawling, open-concept living space with soaring 20-foot ceilings. The room was absolutely packed. I saw regional sales directors in tailored tuxedos, corporate vice presidents mingling by the massive stone fireplace, and wealthy socialites dripping in diamonds. It was a perfectly curated ecosystem of status and power funded entirely by my stolen equity. I scanned the crowded room with predatory focus. It only took me a few seconds to locate the key players in this fraudulent theater. My mother, Patricia, was holding court near the grand staircase. She wore a stunning emerald green gown, her neck adorned with a heavy diamond necklace that I implicitly paid for. She was laughing loudly, tossing her head back as she entertained a group of wealthy older women. My father, Richard, stood near the custom-built wet bar. He held a tumbler of amber liquid, gesturing animatedly as he spoke with a circle of men who looked like banking executives and hedge fund managers. He projected the absolute essence of a successful, relaxed patriarch. Then I spotted Brittany. My sister was positioned right in the center of the room, playing the perfect host. She wore a glittering silver cocktail dress that clung to her figure, a glass of vintage champagne balanced delicately in her fingers. She was leaning into her husband, Jamal. Jamal looked incredibly handsome in a classic black tuxedo, his arm wrapped protectively around Brittany's waist. He was deep in conversation with a man I recognized from business magazines as the regional vice president of his sales firm. Jamal smiled warmly, radiating the genuine confidence of a man who believed he had built an honest, beautiful life for his family. He had absolutely no idea he was standing in a crime scene. I did not just wait at the very edge of the room. I walked straight down the center aisle of the party, flanked by Donovan Miller and Stone. We simply did not blend in. We did not smile. We moved with the rigid, menacing energy of an execution squad. As we cut through the crowd, the atmosphere in the room began to fracture. Guests instinctively stepped aside, sensing the heavy, hostile aura radiating from our group. The polite conversations nearest to us abruptly died out. People lowered their champagne flutes and turned to stare. The silence spread outward like a ripple in a pond, traveling from the foyer all the way to the grand fireplace. Within 30 seconds, the loud booming party had quieted to an uncomfortable, confused murmur. Even the string quartet seemed to falter, the chist missing a beat as he noticed the sudden shift in the room. Patricia was the first to see me. Her loud artificial laugh caught in her throat. Her eyes widened, tracking my path through the crowd. She took in my tailored power suit, the severe styling of my hair, and the 3 intimidating men flanking my sides. The emerald green gown suddenly looked heavy on her frame as the blood completely drained from her face. Richard noticed the sudden silence and turned around. He dropped his tumbler of amber liquid onto the wet bar with a sharp, echoing clatter. Brittany stopped mid-sentence, her silver dress glittering under the chandelier as she stared at me in absolute cold, paralyzing horror. It was truly glorious. We were ready. The music died away. Patricia recovered first, her survival instincts overriding her shock. She set her champagne flute down and marched across the marble floor. Richard was right behind her, his face flushing crimson. They moved frantically to intercept me before I could reach Jamal. Patricia grabbed my forearm, her manicured nails digging into my suit jacket. Her smile remained plastered on her face for the watching guests. but her eyes were frantic and her voice was a venomous hiss. "What do you think you are doing, Clara?" Patricia whispered. Her teeth clenched together. "Get out of here right now before you embarrass us in front of Jamal business partners. You are ruining your sister party." Richard stepped up beside her, trying to block me from view. He leaned down, his voice low and threatening. "I told you what would happen if you trespassed again. Turn around and walk out that door immediately, or I will have security drag you out." I did not flinch. I looked down at Patricia, hand gripping my sleeve, and then I looked her dead in the eye. "Let go of me," I commanded, my voice projecting clearly into the quiet room. Patricia hesitated, glancing nervously at the wealthy socialites who were openly staring at our altercation. She dropped her hand, taking a half step backward. Richard lost his temper. He reached out to grab my shoulder, attempting to physically turn me toward the exit. He never made contact. Stone, the process server, stepped smoothly between us. He intercepted Richard, reaching arm, and pushed it down with a firm block. Richard stumbled back, his eyes widening in shock. Before Richard could shout an indignant protest, Stone raised the thick stack of legal documents he held at his side, with a loud, resonant slap that echoed across the vaulted ceiling. Stone drove the papers directly into the center of Richard's chest. Richard gasped, bringing his hands up to catch the heavy bundle before it hit the floor. He stared down at the bold federal court seals stamped across the front pages. "You have been served," Stone announced, his voice booming with terrifying finality. He pulled a second identical stack of documents from his briefcase, turned to Patricia, and dropped them into her trembling hands. "Patricia, you have also been served. Have a wonderful evening." Patricia looked down at the documents, her lips parting in silent horror, the color completely drained from her face. Richard found his voice, though it cracked with sudden panic. "What is the meaning of this?" he stammered, looking around at the guests who are now pressing closer. "This is a private residence. You cannot just barge in here with garbage lawsuits." That was the exact opening Donovan was waiting for. My attorney stepped forward, positioning himself squarely in the center of the room. Donovan possessed the booming voice of a seasoned federal prosecutor, and he utilized it to its maximum capacity. He ensured that every corporate executive, every wealthy neighbor, and every country club gossip heard his next words with crystal clarity. "These are not garbage lawsuits," Richard Donovan declared, his voice cutting through the tension. "These are formal federal indictments and civil actions filed in the United States District Court. You are being served for federal bank fraud, federal wire fraud, and the criminal forgery of a property deed. Furthermore, you are receiving formal eviction notices mandating that you immediately vacate Clara property, which you have been illegally occupying while running a fraudulent real estate scheme." A collective gasp ripped through the crowded room. Several women covered their mouths, drink, the glass shattering against the stone hearth. The murmurs erupted into a wave of scandalous whispers. Bank fraud, forgery, eviction. These were ruinous words in this circle of high society elites. The pristine image my parents had spent decades cultivating was entirely obliterated in 30 seconds. Patricia looked around wildly like a trapped animal. She saw her affluent friends whispering behind their hands. She tried to deploy her only remaining defense mechanism. She pointed a trembling finger at me and raised her voice, attempting to sound like a heartbroken, victimized mother. "Do not listen to her." Patricia cried out to the crowd. "My daughter is mentally unwell. She made all of this up because she is jealous of her sister's success. These documents are nothing but delusions." Donovan smiled his sharp, predatory smile. He gestured to the man standing quietly next to him. "If my client is delusional, Patricia, perhaps you would like to explain your actions to Mr. Miller. He is the senior fraud investigator for the National Bank, where you fraudulently obtained a $500,000 home equity line of credit using a fake deed." Miller stepped forward, opening his leather briefcase. He pulled out a piece of paper bearing the official letterhead of their bank. His expression was devoid of sympathy. Richard and Patricia Miller stated, his voice flat and bureaucratic. I am officially notifying you that your home equity line of credit has been permanently suspended pending a federal investigation. We have uncovered definitive proof that the collateral was secured using a forged quitclaim deed. Additionally, our fraud division has placed a total freeze on all of your checking savings and investment accounts. The crushing weight of Miller announcement completely paralyzed my parents in place. Patricia dropped the thick legal documents onto the floor, her manicured hands shaking violently. She looked at Richard, her eyes wide with absolute unadulterated terror. Richard stood completely frozen. His mouth hanging open, the heavy federal lawsuits clutched tightly against his chest. He could not form a single word of defense or denial. There was no clever corporate jargon that could possibly save him now. They were completely exposed, financially bankrupt, and facing decades in federal prison. The prestigious guests began backing away from them slowly, as if they were suddenly infected with a highly contagious disease. Brittany broke the silence first. She lunged forward, her silver cocktail dress shimmering as she pointed an accusatory finger at me. "Clara, what is wrong with you?" she shrieked, her voice pitched high with manufactured outrage. "You show up here uninvited, dragging these thugs into my home on New Year's Eve and start throwing around ridiculous legal threats. Have you completely lost your mind? Get out before I call the police." I ignored her entirely. I did not look at her. I did not acknowledge her existence. Instead, I bypassed her completely, my heels clicking on the hardwood floor as I walked straight toward her husband. Jamal was standing near the fireplace, still holding his champagne flute. The warmth had vanished from his face, replaced by a guarded, confused intensity. He looked from Patricia and Richard, who were still paralyzed with shock, to his wife, who was currently screaming at my back, and finally to me. I stopped a few feet away from him. "Jamal," I said, my voice cutting through Brittany. Shrill protests. "I need you to look at something." I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out the forensic accounting report, complete with highlighted bank statements and wire transfer logs. I held the thick stack of documents out toward him. Jamal hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly. He did not immediately take the papers. "What is this, Clara?" he asked, his deep voice rumbling with caution. "What is going on with your parents?" Brittany lunged forward again, attempting to intercept the documents before Jamal could reach them. "Jamal, do not look at that," she pleaded, her voice cracking with sudden, genuine panic. "She is crazy. She has been struggling financially, and now she is trying to drag us down with her. Please just let security handle this." Jamal looked at his wife. He saw the panic in her eyes, the desperate way she reached for the papers, and the sheer terror radiating from her every movement. He slowly extended his hand, bypassing Brittany, outstretched fingers, and took the forensic report from me. I watched his eyes scan the cover page, the logo of the financial investigation firm clearly visible. "Jamal," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level and devoid of any malice toward him. "You are a self-made man. You pride yourself on earning everything you have. You work incredibly hard to pay the mortgage on this house and support your family. I know you believe in financial independence, and I know you despise liars." I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the impact my next words would have on his life. "You should know that your wife designer lifestyle is funded by a forged HELOC loan taken out on my stolen house." Jamal froze. The string quartet had long since stopped playing. The room was so silent you could hear the ice melting in the discarded drink glasses. Jamal looked down at the documents in his hand, his thumb resting on the highlighted bank statements. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. I pointed to the open page. 5 years ago. My grandfather transferred the deed of his house to me via an irrevocable trust. My parents hid this from me. They charged me $3,000 a month in rent for my own property. when I was 2 days late on a payment because I gave Brittany $4,000 for your son emergency hospital visit. They evicted me on Christmas morning. Jamal's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. You paid for his hospital visit, he demanded. Brittany told me her trust fund covered it. I shook my head. There is no trust fund. Jamal, there never was. My parents used my rent money to pay the mortgage on this very house. And when they realized they needed more cash, they forged my signature on a quitclaim deed, stole my property, and took out a $500,000 home equity line of credit. I tapped the financial ledger in his hands. $300,000 of that stolen federal loan was wired directly into Brittany's personal checking account over the last 6 months. She used my stolen equity to buy her designer bags, lease her sports car, and fund her influencer lifestyle. Brittany let out a strangled sob. Jamal, she is lying. It is all a lie. The trust fund is real. My parents gave it to me. They can prove it. She turned desperately toward Patricia and Richard, who were still standing near the foyer, clutching the federal lawsuits. Mom, Dad, tell him Clara is lying. Patricia opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Richard looked away, unable to meet Jamal's gaze. Their silence was the most damning confirmation possible. Jamal stared at them, the realization slowly settling over his features. He looked back down at the bank statements, his eyes tracing the highlighted wire transfers from the Richard and Patricia Shell Company directly into Brittany's account. He saw the corresponding purchases at luxury boutiques and country clubs. He saw the undeniable documented proof of their financial parasitism. He looked at Brittany. His expression was not angry. It was something far worse. It was the cold, hollow look of a man who suddenly realized he was married to a stranger. You lied to me, Jamal said, his voice terrifyingly quiet. You told me your parents set up a trust. You told me you were financially independent. You told me you paid for his hospital visit with your own money. Brittany reached for his arm, tears streaming down her face. Jamal, please, she begged, her voice trembling. I just wanted to contribute. I wanted to maintain our lifestyle. My parents said it was fine. They said Clara did not need the money. They said the house was legally theirs to use. Jamal pulled his arm away, his face hardening into a mask of pure disgust. You stole from your own sister, he stated, the realization cementing in his mind. You let your parents evict her into a blizzard on Christmas morning while you spent her money on designer clothes. You let her pay the mortgage on the house I work 80 hours a week to provide for you. You funded your entire existence through felony fraud, and you lied to my face every single day. The guests watched in stunned silence as the illusion of their perfect marriage shattered in real time. Jamal did not say another word right away. He lowered his head and focused entirely on the forensic accounting report in his hands. His eyes, trained by years of corporate sales forecasting and ruthless financial analysis, scanned the dense ledgers with terrifying speed. He connected the dots with the cold precision of a machine. He matched the dates of the wire transfers from the shell company of Richard and Patricia to the exact days Brittany came home with a new designer handbag or announced a spontaneous luxury spa weekend. He saw the withdrawal for the down payment on the very mansion we were currently standing in. He saw the exact transfer amounts aligning perfectly with the fraudulent home equity line of credit. The irrefutable mathematical truth stared back at him. There was no generational wealth. There was no trust fund. There was only a calculated malicious theft orchestrated by the people who smiled at his dinner table every Sunday. Brittany tried to close the physical distance between them. She reached out with trembling hands, her silver bracelets clinking together, and gently touched his tuxedo jacket. Jamal, please, she whimpered, her voice cracking with perfectly manufactured despair. You have to understand how much pressure I was under. Mom and Dad told me this was the only way to maintain our image. They said Clara was unstable and would just waste the money anyway. I was just trying to protect our family. I wanted to be the perfect wife for you. I was scared that if I did not keep up appearances, you would realize I was not good enough for your world." The tears spilled over her eyelashes, ruining her expensive mascara. She looked small, fragile, and utterly desperate. It was the exact same performance she had used since childhood to evade consequences. She weaponized her tears, playing the ultimate victim of our parents' overbearing expectations, hoping her husband would swoop in to rescue her from the cruel, vindictive sister who was ruining their holiday. But Jamal was not Richard. He was not a man who valued fake social standing over genuine character. He had grown up with nothing, built his career through relentless 80-hour work weeks, and guarded his professional integrity with his life. He looked down at his wife, trembling fingers resting on his lapel. The warmth he had always shown her completely evaporated, replaced by a glacial, unyielding disgust. He realized in that agonizing moment that the woman he married did not actually exist. The supportive, independently wealthy partner was a phantom. In her place stood a deeply entitled, remorseless parasite, who had gladly watched her own sister freeze in a parking lot just to finance a wardrobe she could not afford. The fundamental breach of trust was absolute. He gently but firmly reached up and removed her hand from his jacket, letting her arm drop limply to her side. Jamal took a slow, deep breath, expanding his chest as he straightened to his full height. He looked at the crystal champagne flute he was still holding in his left hand. The expensive vintage bubbled cheerfully, a glaring symbol of the fraudulent luxury surrounding him. With a sudden explosive burst of suppressed rage, Jamal hurled the crystal flute directly into the massive stone fireplace. The glass shattered with a violent, ear-splitting crash, raining sparkling shards across the hearth. The violent sound made several guests physically jump backward. Brittany let out a terrified shriek, covering her face with her hands. The remaining ambient noise in the mansion died instantly. The room was paralyzed in total shock. Jamal turned his back on the fireplace and faced the crowd. He looked directly at his corporate partners, the regional sales directors, and the wealthy socialites who had come to celebrate his success. "I want to apologize to all of my guests for this disruption," Jamal announced, his deep voice carrying the unmistakable weight of absolute authority. "You came here tonight to celebrate the new year with my wife and me, but I have just discovered that the woman standing next to me is a complete fraud. She is a liar. She and her parents have engaged in a highly coordinated, malicious scheme to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars from her own sister. They committed federal bank fraud to fund the liquor you are drinking, the food you are eating, and the very roof over our heads. I refuse to be associated with thieves." He turned back to Brittany. She was shaking uncontrollably, her fake tears replaced by genuine suffocating panic. The social execution was happening right in front of the people whose approval she craved like oxygen. Her entire carefully constructed world of status and extreme privilege was dissolving before her very eyes, leaving her utterly exposed and completely defenseless against the harsh, undeniable reality of her own terrible actions. "Jamal, please stop," she begged, her voice barely a squeak. "We can fix this in private. Do not do this to me in front of everyone." Jamal stepped closer to her, his expression carved from stone. "We are not fixing anything," he stated coldly. "My integrity is the only thing I truly own in this world, and I absolutely refuse to remain legally bound to a felon. I want you to walk up those stairs right now. I want you to pack your stolen designer clothes, your stolen jewelry, and every single material possession you purchased with the stolen money of your sister. You are going to pack those bags immediately, and you are going to get out of my house before this night ends. You can go stay with your criminal parents in a cheap motel, or you can go wait with them in whatever federal jail cell they inevitably end up in. We are entirely done. Brittany, do not make me call the authorities to physically remove you from this property." Brittany stared at Jamal with wild eyes. The absolute finality in his voice bounced off her ingrained sense of entitlement. She planted her designer heels into the Persian rug, crossing her arms in a desperate display of defiance. "You cannot kick me out of my own house! Jamal!" she yelled, her voice echoing shrilly across the vaulted ceiling. "I am on the title of this property. Half of this mansion belongs to me. I am not going anywhere. We can just pay Clara back and make this ridiculous problem go away." Her utter failure to grasp the severity of her situation was almost fascinating to watch. She honestly believed that returning the stolen money would magically erase the federal crimes she and our parents had committed. She remained completely blind to the fact that her luxurious suburban fantasy was already burning to the ground. She thought her status as a homeowner gave her leverage. That was the exact moment Miller introduced himself. The senior bank fraud investigator stepped past Donovan and positioned himself squarely between Brittany and Jamal. He adjusted his dark tie, projecting the cold, bureaucratic authority of an institution that possessed zero capacity for mercy. "Mrs. Brittany Miller," said, his voice carrying the dry, clinical tone of a corporate executioner. "I am Senior Investigator Miller with the Federal Fraud Division of the National Bank that currently holds the primary mortgage on this property. You seem to be operating under a severe misconception. Let me clarify your situation." Brittany blinked, her defiance faltering as she looked at the grim man in the dark suit. Miller opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of bank stationery. He held up a document bearing the official seal of the bank legal department. "You do not own this house," Miller stated clearly. "When your parents orchestrated a fraudulent home equity line of credit using a forged quitclaim deed against your sister paid-off property, they triggered a massive federal violation. Our forensic accounting team has traced every single dollar of that $500,000 theft. We know exactly where the funds were routed." Miller turned to address the wider room, ensuring that every corporate executive and socialite heard the precise details of her downfall. "We have irrefutable proof that $300,000 of stolen federal funds were wired directly into checking accounts solely controlled by you, Brittany. Those stolen funds were subsequently used to pay the down payment and monthly mortgage installments on this very mansion, because this property was purchased using the proceeds of a federal bank fraud scheme. It is classified as the product of a criminal enterprise." The color completely washed out of Brittany's face. Her mouth opened, but she could not produce a single sound. Miller turned his cold gaze back to her. "Effective immediately. The bank has initiated a total freeze on all of your checking, savings, and investment accounts. You currently have zero access to liquid capital. Furthermore, our legal department filed an emergency injunction this afternoon. The bank is placing a massive non-negotiable lien on this entire estate. We are seizing this property to recover the stolen funds. You are not being kicked out by your husband. You are being formally evicted by the bank. You have 48 hours to vacate before federal marshals arrive to change the locks." The absolute devastation of Miller's announcement hung in the air like heavy smoke. The illusion of the golden child was completely vaporized. Brittany was a broke, soon-to-be homeless fraudster facing federal indictment. Jamal looked at his wife with a mixture of pity and revulsion, realizing that the very foundation of their life together was built on stolen ground. He did not need to fight her for the house in a divorce settlement. The bank was taking it from both of them, though Jamal would easily recover with his legitimate corporate income. Brittany had absolutely nothing left. Patricia and Richard, who had been cowering near the grand staircase, let out simultaneous gasps of horror. The full weight of their actions finally crashed down upon them. They had completely destroyed their favorite daughter. They had handed her the stolen money that was now acting as the catalyst for her absolute ruin. They were all going to lose everything: the luxury cars, the country club memberships, the sprawling suburban homes. It was all gone, evaporated by the relentless light of the truth. The reaction from the party guests was instantaneous and brutal. These were people who guarded their reputations and corporate networks with ruthless vigilance. The realization that they were currently drinking champagne in a house about to be seized by federal marshals sent a shockwave of sheer panic through the crowd. No one wanted their name associated with a federal bank fraud investigation. No one wanted to be photographed at a crime scene. The exodus began as a hurried whisper and rapidly escalated into a panicked stampede. Regional sales directors grabbed their coats and abandoned their drinks on mahogany tables. Wealthy socialites practically sprinted toward the foyer, pushing past each other in a desperate bid to reach the valet stand. The string quartet packed up their instruments with frantic speed. The grand mansion transformed from an ultra-exclusive celebration into a chaotic, desperate evacuation. I stood flanked by Donovan and Miller, watching the destruction. I felt zero guilt. Patricia desperately grabbed at her fleeing friends, begging them to listen. They shoved past her toward the door. Richard slumped against the bar, defeated. Brittany collapsed onto the rug, sobbing as she realized she was losing her husband, home, money, and freedom. The trap had snapped shut with flawless precision. The house emptied out, leaving only the sound of shattered glass and the heavy silence of absolute ruin. I looked at my attorney, feeling a profound sense of closure wash over my tired body. Donovan gave me a brief approving nod. The public execution was finished, and my long nightmare was finally over. The weeks following that New Year Eve party unfolded with swift, brutal efficiency. Federal authorities do not operate on delayed timelines when $500,000 of stolen funds are involved. By early January, the National Bank officially foreclosed on the suburban mansion. I drove past the sprawling property once just to see the final result of their greed for myself. A heavy chain secured the wrought iron gates, and an official federal seizure notice was plastered across those massive double oak doors. Brittany and her fake influencer lifestyle were gone. My parents and their arrogant country club attitudes were permanently gone. The glittering illusion they spent years constructing had collapsed into a massive pile of worthless rubble on the pavement. Donovan ensured the federal indictments hit my parents with maximum velocity, because the forensic accounting report provided an undeniable paper trail of wire fraud and the forged quitclaim deed. The FBI skipped a lengthy preliminary investigation. Richard and Patricia were formally arrested on multiple felony charges. Their passports were confiscated, and their bank accounts were frozen by the government. They were stripped of their country club memberships overnight. Their wealthy friends, terrified of being implicated in a federal financial crime, abandoned them entirely, without access to their money and facing a massive legal battle. My parents were forced into a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city. The man who constantly lectured me on fiscal responsibility was now facing 20 years in federal prison, spending his days sitting in a dingy room that smelled of stale cigarette smoke. Brittany faced an equally devastating fate. Jamal filed for divorce the very next morning. He retained a high-powered attorney and used the bank fraud evidence to secure an emergency custody order. Because Brittany was deeply implicated in the federal investigation and had zero legitimate income or housing, the judge granted Jamal full physical and legal custody of their son. Jamal sold his legitimate assets, packed up his boy, and relocated to a new home in a different state, cutting Brittany out of his life. My sister was left drowning in toxic debt. The bank pursued her for the luxury vehicles and the remaining balance of the stolen funds. She was forced to declare bankruptcy and move into a cramped apartment with roommates working a retail job to survive. I thought I had heard the last of them until a late Tuesday evening in February. I was sitting in my temporary hotel room reviewing supply chain contracts when my cell phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. I answered cautiously. "Clara." A voice rasped through the speaker. It was Patricia. She sounded exhausted, her voice stripped of its usual haughty arrogance. She wept loudly, the sound echoing through the cheap connection. "Clara, please, you have to stop this. Call your lawyer and drop the charges. Your father is having panic attacks. We have no money left. We are eating canned soup in a filthy motel. Please, for the sake of family, show some mercy. We are sorry. We will do anything you ask." I listened to her sob. I searched my heart for a single ounce of sympathy for that ingrained daughterly instinct that used to make me bend to their will. There was absolutely nothing there. They were not sorry for what they had done. They were only sorry they had been caught. You evicted me into a freezing blizzard on Christmas morning over a rent payment for a house I already owned. I stated, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. You stole my property. You financed a luxury mansion with my equity. You tried to destroy my credit so I could never fight back. You have no family. Patricia, you traded your family for a country club membership and a designer wardrobe. Clara, please. She wailed in sheer desperation. We are your parents. You cannot abandon us like this. How are we supposed to survive? I remembered the exact words my sister had spoken to me while my mother watched me freeze. I took a deep breath, feeling the final chain of their toxic control snap forever. Good luck starting over, I said. I hung up the phone. I blocked the unknown number and then contacted my cellular provider to permanently change my number. The boundary was set in stone. They were eradicated from my life, with the criminal charges in the hands of federal prosecutors. The bank quietly released the holds on my grandfather's estate. I officially took possession of the house. I did not want to live in the space where I had been deeply manipulated. So, I immediately listed it on the market. Thanks to a booming real estate sector, the house sold in less than 2 weeks for a massive profit. I took that money, combined it with my restored savings, and purchased a stunning penthouse apartment in the heart of downtown Chicago. It features floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake, and no one has a key except me. My professional life mirrored my personal victory, unburdened by the constant financial demands of my toxic family. I poured my focused energy into my career. My performance skyrocketed. 2 months later, the corporate board promoted me to director of supply chain with a massive salary increase and a corner office. I finally have the freedom to travel, invest, and simply exist without the suffocating weight of conditional love. I built a beautiful drama-free life entirely on my terms. Financial abuse within a family is one of the most hidden and destructive forms of betrayal. Family is supposed to be your safe haven, but sometimes they are the very people you need protection from. Has your family ever crossed a legal line? Share your story in the comments below. If this resonated with you, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of overcoming toxic relationships and claiming your independence. Thank you for listening. And remember to always know your own worth. The story of Clara and her family offers a stark, chilling, yet profoundly necessary lesson. Biological ties do not grant immunity from accountability, nor do they excuse systemic abuse. For too long, society has peddled the narrative that family is unconditionally everything, often pressuring victims of toxic dynamics to silently endure financial exploitation, emotional manipulation, and gaslighting simply because the perpetrators share their DNA. Clara's journey definitively shatters this dangerous misconception, proving that the ultimate act of self-preservation is sometimes walking away entirely. The most striking takeaway is the realization that toxic individuals often weaponize our best traits against us. Clara's parents and sister exploited her sense of responsibility, her relentless work ethic, and her deep empathy. They drained her emergency savings because they knew she would do the right thing for her sick nephew, subsequently punishing her very compassion to fund their own illusions of grandeur. This teaches us that establishing ironclad boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is a fundamental act of survival. When family members view you merely as a financial resource, rather than a human being continuing to appease them, only deepens the destructive cycle of abuse. Clara's victory was not merely about regaining a stolen house or exposing a massive financial fraud. Her true triumph was achieving complete emotional independence. By refusing to accept the false narrative that she was a failure, she broke a lifelong trauma bond. She utilized cold, hard facts to dismantle psychological manipulation. Sometimes the only way to heal from deeply ingrained family toxicity is to stop seeking their validation. Accept who they truly are, and sever the connection without apology. If you recognize these patterns of manipulation in your own life, prioritize your peace today by setting a firm boundary to protect your future.